Marco had been cleaning the Apostolic Palace for 15 years, but he'd never been assigned to the 13th floor. Officially, the building only had 12 floors. The blueprints showed 12. The elevator buttons only went to 12. But Marco knew better. It started during his third week on the night shift. While mopping the 12th floor corridor at 3 a.m., he noticed something odd about the stairwell. The steps continued upward past the final landing, disappearing into darkness that his flashlight couldn't penetrate. When he asked his supervisor about it the next morning, Father Benedetti's face went pale. "There are only 12 floors, Marco. You must have been tired." But curiosity is a dangerous thing in the Vatican's halls. 3 months later, Marco finally worked up the courage to climb those phantom stairs. Each step creaked ominously under his feet, the sound echoing strangely, as if the walls themselves were whispering. The higher he climbed, the colder it became. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air. At the top, he found a door marked with a symbol he didn't recognize, not quite a cross, but something older, more angular. The brass handle was ice cold against his palm. The 13th floor was a mirror image of the 12th, but wrong in every detail. The paintings on the walls showed familiar religious scenes, but the faces were subtly distorted saints with too many eyes, angels with predatory grins. The hallway stretched impossibly long, lined with doors that had no numbers, only that same strange symbol. Marco's footsteps echoed differently here, as if the floor were hollow beneath him. The air tasted metallic, like old coins or dried blood. From somewhere in the distance, he could hear what sounded like chanting, but in no language he recognized. He tried the first door, locked. The second, locked. But the third door opened with a soft sigh. Inside was an office that looked exactly like Pope Pius XII's private study, which Marco had cleaned many times in old photographs and historical recreations. But this wasn't a recreation. The papers on the desk were fresh, the ink still wet. A half-eaten meal sat on a silver tray, still warm. And in the corner, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains, sat a figure in papal robes. "Your Holiness?" Marco whispered. The figure turned, and Marco saw a face he recognized from history books: Pope Pius XII, who had died in 1958. But the Pope's eyes were black holes, and when he smiled, his teeth were filed to points. "Welcome, my child," the dead Pope said in a voice like grinding stone. "I've been waiting for someone to clean this mess." Marco ran. He ran down those impossible stairs, through the corridors of the 12th floor, not stopping until he reached the main entrance. But when he looked back, the building had only 12 floors. The next night, Marco found a note in his cleaning supplies. 13th floor, 3 a.m. Don't keep us waiting. He never showed up for work again. His replacement, a young man named Giuseppe, noticed something odd about the stairwell on his third week. Sister Rosa had been the night custodian for St. Peter's Basilica for 8 years, when she first heard the confessional booth in the chapel of the Presentation speaking to itself. It was a Tuesday in November, well past midnight. The basilica was empty except for the Swiss guard at their posts, and Rosa with her mop and bucket. She was cleaning near the chapel when she heard the unmistakable sound of voices, a penitent confessing, and a priest offering absolution. This wasn't entirely unusual. Sometimes priests worked late, hearing confessions from troubled souls who couldn't wait for morning. But when Rosa peeked around the corner, the confessional booth was dark, and no one was entering or leaving. The voices continued, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Rosa approached cautiously. The voice was muffled by the wooden partition, but she could make out words about terrible deeds, about blood on hands that wouldn't wash clean, about the screaming that wouldn't stop. She knocked gently on the booth. The voices stopped immediately. "Hello? Is someone there?" she called softly. No response. Rosa opened the penitent's side of the booth. Empty. She checked the priest's compartment. Also empty. But the kneeler on the penitent's side was warm, as if someone had just been there. The next night, the same thing happened. And the night after that. By the fourth night, Rosa had worked up the courage to hide behind a pillar and watch. At exactly 12:47 a.m., the confessional began to glow with a soft, sickly light. The voices started again, but this time Rosa could see that the booth was still empty. She crept closer, straining to hear the confession. "I killed them all, Father. The children in the orphanage. I told them I was taking them to heaven. But I did things, terrible things, and now they won't stop visiting me. They stand at the foot of my bed every night, their little faces rotting, asking why I hurt them." The priest's voice responded, "My son, there are some sins that cannot be absolved, some souls that cannot be saved. You must carry this burden for eternity." "But Father, I am carrying it. I've been carrying it for 70 years. I died in 1953, and still they come for me. Still I must confess, every night, forever." Rosa's blood turned to ice. She recognized that voice, now Father DeMarco, who had been found dead in his cell in 1953 under mysterious circumstances. The church had covered up the scandal, but the whispers among the older staff spoke of unspeakable crimes against children. As if sensing her recognition, both voices in the confessional stopped. Then, slowly, the door to the penitent's side began to creak open. Rosa ran, her cleaning cart clattering behind her, but she could hear footsteps following, not the footsteps of the living, but the wet, dragging shuffle of something that should be buried. The next morning, Rosa submitted her resignation, but Mother Superior wouldn't accept it. "You can't leave, Sister Rosa," the elderly nun said with a sad smile. "Don't you understand? The confessional chooses its witnesses. It needs someone to hear what cannot be absolved." That night, Rosa found herself back at the confessional, not by choice but compelled by something beyond her understanding. At 12:47 a.m., the voices began again. But this time, there was a third voice, her own, asking for forgiveness for the sins she was about to witness. Rosa understood now. She was no longer just the custodian of the basilica. She was the keeper of its darkest secrets. Giovanni's hands shook as he unlocked the door to the papal apartments. In 3 decades of service to the Vatican, he had never been assigned to clean the Pope's private quarters during His Holiness's absence. It was an honor reserved for only the most trusted staff. But tonight felt different, wrong. The apartments were elegant and sparse, befitting a man of simple tastes. Giovanni moved through the rooms methodically, dusting surfaces and replacing flowers. Everything was perfectly normal until he reached the Pope's private study. A man in cardinal's robes sat reading at the Pope's desk. "Excuse me, Your Eminence," Giovanni stammered, bowing deeply. "I wasn't informed anyone would be here." The cardinal didn't look up from his reading. "Continue your work, my son. Pay me no mind." Giovanni nodded and continued cleaning, but something nagged at him. The cardinal's presence felt heavy. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive. As Giovanni polished a silver crucifix, he snuck glances at the cardinal. The man's skin was pale, almost translucent, and his breathing was barely perceptible. Most disturbing were his hands. They were stained dark, as if dipped in ink or blood. "Your Eminence," Giovanni ventured, "might I ask what you're reading?" The cardinal finally looked up, and Giovanni's heart nearly stopped. The man's eyes were completely white, no pupils visible. When he smiled, his teeth were stained, the same dark color as his hands. "The names," the cardinal said, in a voice like rustling parchment. "I'm reading the names of all the children who died in the church's care, all the innocents whose blood cries out for justice." Giovanni dropped his cleaning rag. I should go." "No," the cardinal said, rising from the chair. As he stood, Giovanni realized the man cast no shadow. "You need to see this. Someone needs to witness." The cardinal opened the book he'd been reading and held it toward Giovanni. The pages were blank, but as Giovanni watched in horror, names began to appear, written in what looked like blood. Hundreds of names. Thousands. Every name written in blood. The cardinal continued, his white eyes never leaving Giovanni's face. Every life cut short by those who should have protected them. Do you know how many volumes this book has? Giovanni couldn't speak. He wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. 47 volumes, the cardinal answered himself. And still growing. Every night, I add more names. The Church's greatest shame, preserved forever. The cardinal began walking toward Giovanni, and with each step, his form became more translucent, but his voice grew stronger, more accusatory. And where was God when these children suffered? Where was divine intervention? Where was justice? Giovanni finally found his voice. Who are you? The cardinal stopped just inches from Giovanni's face. Up close, Giovanni could see through him to the wall behind. When the specter spoke, his breath was like ice against Giovanni's skin. I am Cardinal Torretti. I died in 1967, and I have spent every night since documenting the Church's sins. The Pope knows I'm here. They all know. But they say nothing, because some truths are too terrible to acknowledge. The room began to spin around Giovanni. The walls seemed to pulse like a living thing, and he could hear the distant sound of children crying. Tell them, the cardinal whispered, his form beginning to fade. Tell them that the dead remember. Tell them that some sins echo through eternity. Giovanni found himself alone in the study, gasping for air. The book on the desk was gone, but on the surface where it had been, a single word was carved into the wood. Remember. The next morning, Giovanni tried to report the incident to his supervisor, but when he led Father Martinez to the Pope's study, the carved word was gone. Perhaps you were overtired, Father Martinez suggested. Night shifts can play tricks on the mind. But Giovanni knew what he had seen. And now, every night, when he cleaned the papal apartments, he could hear the soft sound of pages turning in the empty study, and the whisper of a quill pen writing names in blood. Anna had been cleaning the Sistine Chapel for 2 years, but she had never seen it like this. It was 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning in March. The chapel should have been empty, dark except for the small security lights. Instead, it was filled with the warm glow of hundreds of candles, and every pew was occupied by figures in religious robes. Anna stood in the doorway, paralyzed by confusion and fear. A service was taking place. She could hear the familiar cadence of Latin prayers, but this was impossible. No, Mass was scheduled. The chapel was locked. She had the only key. At the altar stood a priest she didn't recognize, his face obscured by shadows despite the candlelight. His voice echoed strangely in the space, the Latin words seeming to come from everywhere at once. The congregation responded in unison, their voices creating an otherworldly harmony that made Anna's bones ache. But as her eyes adjusted to the light, she began to notice details that made her stomach turn. The worshippers were wrong. Their robes were not the clean white and gold of modern vestments, but stained and tattered. Some looked medieval, others even older. And when they turned their heads to respond to the priest's calls, Anna caught glimpses of faces that were incomplete. Missing eyes, rotting flesh, jaws that hung at impossible angles. This was a congregation of the dead. Anna tried to back away, but the door had closed behind her. When she turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. She was trapped in this midnight mass of the damned. The priest at the altar raised a chalice, and Anna's blood froze as she recognized it. The actual papal chalice, made of pure gold and encrusted with precious stones. It should have been locked away in the Vatican treasury. Corpus Christi, the priest intoned, but his voice was different now, layered with screams and whispers. The communion wine that filled the chalice was not wine. It was dark, thick, and when the priest drank from it, the liquid ran down his chin like blood. One by one, the congregation began to approach the altar for communion. As they walked past Anna's hiding spot behind a pillar, she could see them more clearly. These were not recent dead. Some wore the robes of popes from centuries past, others the simple habits of medieval monks. All bore the marks of violent deaths. Here was a pope with a crushed skull, there a cardinal with a noose around his neck, bishops with sword wounds, abbots with their throats cut. The Church's dark history walking among the living. The priest turned toward Anna, and she saw his face for the first time. It was Pope Urban VIII, who had died in 1644. But his skin was gray and mottled, and maggots crawled from his eye sockets. "Come, my child," he said, extending the chalice toward her. "Join us in eternal communion." Anna tried to scream, but no sound came out. The dead congregation turned to look at her with their hollow eyes and rotting faces. Some smiled with lipless mouths, others wept blood. "Every night," the dead pope continued, "we gather here to celebrate the Mass of the damned, to consecrate the sins of the living church, to drink the blood of innocents spilled in God's name." The congregation began to chant, their voices rising to a crescendo that made the ancient frescoes on the ceiling seem to writhe and move. Michelangelo's masterpiece twisted into scenes of damnation and despair. Anna closed her eyes and prayed harder than she had ever prayed in her life. When she opened them again, the chapel was dark and empty. The candles were gone. The congregation vanished. But on the altar, the papal chalice remained, half filled with something dark that reflected no light. Anna ran from the chapel and didn't stop running until she reached the main entrance of the Vatican. But when security reviewed the cameras the next morning, they showed Anna entering the chapel alone and emerging minutes later. The chalice was back in the treasury, exactly where it belonged. The only evidence of her experience was a single word written in what looked like blood on the chapel's guest register: "Witnessed." Anna quit the next day, but her replacement reported the same strange occurrence exactly 1 month later, and the month after that. The Sistine Chapel's Midnight Mass continues to this day, a gathering of the Church's darkest souls, seeking absolution that will never come. Some say, if you listen carefully during regular tours of the chapel, you can still hear the faint echo of their damned prayers. Brother Marco had been cleaning the Vatican's restricted archives for 12 years when he first heard them whispers that seemed to seep from the ancient stone walls themselves. At first, he dismissed them as the settling of old buildings or perhaps the echo of conversations from distant corridors. But as the weeks passed, the whispers grew more distinct, more insistent. It began during his midnight shift in the deepest level of the secret archives, a place few were permitted to enter. Marco's security clearance allowed him access to clean the reading rooms and preserve the delicate manuscripts from dust and decay. The air down there was thick and stale, heavy with the weight of centuries-old secrets. The whispers started as a low murmur, like prayers spoken in a language he couldn't identify. They seemed to emanate from behind a particular wall lined with forbidden text documents that bore the seal of long-dead popes and bore warnings in Latin that made even Marco, a lifelong servant of the Church, feel uneasy. One night, while carefully dusting a glass case containing what appeared to be correspondence between Pope Innocent VIII and an unknown recipient, Marco heard his name spoken clearly in the whispers. He froze, his cleaning cloth suspended mid-air. The voice was neither male nor female, neither old nor young. It was something else entirely. "Marco, Marco, come closer." His hands trembling, Marco approached the wall. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Behind the ancient stones, he could hear what sounded like scratching, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and his breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. As he pressed his ear to the wall, the whispers ceased abruptly. In the oppressive silence that followed, Marco heard something far worse, the sound of breathing that wasn't his own, coming from directly behind the stones. Whatever was back there was alive, and it was listening. The next morning, Marco reported the incident to Father Giuseppe, the archive supervisor. The elderly priest's face went pale as Marco described the whispers and the breathing. After a long pause, Father Giuseppe revealed what Marco had never been told. The wall he'd been hearing the voices from was built in 1563 to seal off a chamber where the Church had imprisoned a heretic who claimed to commune with entities beyond the veil of death. "The man died in that room," Father Giuseppe whispered. "But according to the records, His voice could still be heard for months afterward, teaching forbidden knowledge to anyone who would listen. They sealed the chamber with blessed stones and holy water, but he never finished the sentence. But Marco understood. Some seals were never meant to be permanent. That night, Marco returned to his duties with a crucifix clutched tightly in his hand. The whispers began again as soon as he entered the archives, but now they were different. They spoke of things that chilled his soul, predictions of future calamities, secrets about church officials that could destroy lives, and knowledge that no mortal should possess. The worst part was that Marco found himself listening, found himself remembering every word, and slowly he began to understand that the voice wasn't just communicating with him, it was changing him. Each night, he felt a little less like himself, and a little more like something else. On his final night in the archives, Marco discovered that the wall had developed a crack, a thin line of darkness that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. From that crack came not just whispers, but a cold wind that carried with it the scent of decay and despair. Marco never returned to work. They found him the next morning in his quarters, muttering incoherently about the ones behind the wall and the knowledge that burns. He was transferred to a monastery for the mentally unfit, where he spent his remaining days writing down everything the voice had taught him. The crack in the wall was sealed again, blessed by 3 different priests and reinforced with modern materials. But sometimes, late at night, the current archivists report that they can still hear something, not whispers this time, but what sounds like teaching. And they've noticed that some of the younger staff members have begun asking very unusual questions about church history. Sister Maria Esperanza had always taken pride in her work, maintaining the small private chapels scattered throughout the Vatican. These intimate spaces, used by high-ranking clergy for personal prayer and meditation, required a delicate touch. The frescoes were centuries old, the marble altars were priceless works of art, and the ornate mirrors that adorned some of the chambers needed constant care to maintain their pristine condition. It was in the chapel of St. Bartholomew that Sister Maria first noticed something wrong with her reflection. The chapel was one of the older ones, dating back to the Renaissance, and featured a large ornate mirror positioned behind the altar, an unusual architectural choice that had always made her slightly uncomfortable. The mirror was framed in gold leaf and carved cherubs, their faces worn smooth by age. At first, the discrepancy was subtle. While cleaning the mirror one evening, Sister Maria noticed that her reflection seemed to lag behind her movements by a fraction of a second. She would raise her cloth to clean a spot, and her reflection would follow a heartbeat later. She blamed it on fatigue and the poor lighting in the chapel. But as the nights passed, the delay became more pronounced. Her reflection would continue moving even after she had stopped, would turn its head when hers was still, would smile when her face was solemn. Most disturbing of all, her reflection began to appear even when she wasn't standing directly in front of the mirror. One night, while cleaning the altar candles, Sister Maria caught sight of movement in her peripheral vision. She turned to see her reflection in the mirror, but she was standing with her back to it. The reflection was facing her, watching her with an expression of cold intelligence that she had never worn. Terrified but unable to look away, Sister Maria slowly turned to face the mirror directly. Her reflection did not mirror this movement. Instead, it remained facing forward, and as Sister Maria watched in growing horror, the reflection began to mouth words. She couldn't hear what it was saying, but she could read its lips. "Let me out." Sister Maria fled the chapel and didn't return for 3 days. When she finally worked up the courage to resume her duties, she brought with her a bottle of holy water and a prayer book. But the reflection was waiting for her, and this time it wasn't alone. Behind her reflected self, Sister Maria could see other figurish shadowy forms that seemed to press against the glass from the other side. They had faces, but they were wrong somehow, distorted and hungry. Her reflection gestured toward these figures, and Sister Maria realized with dawning terror that they were reflections, 2 reflections, of people who were no longer casting them. Night after night, the population behind the mirror grew. Sister Maria began to recognize some of the faces. former Vatican staff who had died over the years, priests who had served in the chapel, even what appeared to be some of the Renaissance-era figures from the frescoes on the walls. They all stood behind her reflection, watching, waiting. The worst revelation came when Sister Maria realized that her reflection had been learning from watching her. It knew her routines, her prayers, even her private thoughts that she shared with no one but God. And it had been growing stronger, more independent, with each passing day. One night, as Sister Maria approached the mirror to begin her cleaning, her reflection raised its hand in a gesture for her to stop. For the first time, she could hear it speak, its voice a perfect mimicry of her own, but carrying an undertone of something ancient and malevolent. "I don't need you anymore," it said. Sister Maria watched in horror as her reflection stepped sideways out of the mirror's view, disappearing from the glass entirely. But she could still see the other figures, and they were all looking at something outside the mirror's range, looking at her with expressions of anticipation and hunger. The next morning, the cleaning staff found Sister Maria standing motionless in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection with a blank expression. When they spoke to her, she responded, but something was wrong with her voice, wrong with the way she moved. It was as if she was copying behaviors rather than naturally expressing them. The mirror was removed from the chapel and stored in the Vatican's restricted vaults, but Sister Marior, the thing wearing her form, continued her duties. The other staff members began to notice discrepancies. She would sometimes forget basic prayers, would move with an unnatural precision, and would occasionally be seen having conversations with herself in empty rooms. Most disturbing of all, other staff members began reporting problems with their own reflections in mirrors throughout the Vatican. The phenomenon was spreading, and those who had been affected shared one common trait. They had all spent time in the chapel of St. Bartholomew. The chapel was sealed and blessed, but the damage was done. And sometimes, visitors to other parts of the Vatican report seeing figures in mirrors who don't match the people standing in front of them, figures that seem to be teaching the reflections how to be more human, more convincing. Maintenance worker Giuseppe Toretti had been servicing the Vatican's mechanical systems for over 15 years. But he had never encountered an elevator quite like the one hidden behind an unmarked door in the basement of the Apostolic Palace. The door itself was unremarkable painted, the same institutional beige as dozens of others throughout the building, but it bore no signage, no indication of what lay beyond. Giuseppe discovered it during a routine inspection of the building's electrical systems. His blueprint showed nothing but storage space in that area, but when he opened the door, he found a small elevator with brass fittings that looked far older than any other mechanical system in the building. The elevator had only two buttons, one marked with a simple cross and another marked with a symbol he didn't recognize, something that looked like an inverted pentagram surrounded by Latin text too small to read clearly. Curiosity got the better of him. Giuseppe pressed the button marked with the cross, and the elevator began its descent with a mechanical grinding that suggested it hadn't been used in years. But according to his count of the floors, the elevator traveled far deeper than should have been possible. The basement levels of the Vatican were extensive, but this elevator descended for nearly 2 minutes before finally shuddering to a stop. When the doors opened, Giuseppe found himself in a circular chamber carved from solid rock. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing what appeared to be religious artifacts, but not like any he had seen before. There were crucifixes that seemed to be made from some dark metal that absorbed light, chalices carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and books bound in what looked like human skin. At the center of the chamber stood an altar, and upon it lay an open tome written in a script that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at it. The air in the chamber was thick and oppressive, carrying scents of sulfur and decay that made Giuseppe's eyes water. But what truly unnerved him were the sounds. From somewhere deeper in the chamber, from passages that seemed to extend beyond what his flashlight could illuminate, came the sound of chanting. Not the familiar Latin of church services, but something older, something that made his teeth ache and his skin crawl. Giuseppe quickly returned to the elevator and pressed the button to ascend, but nothing happened. The elevator remained motionless, its doors open to the chamber. Panic beginning to set in, he tried the other button, the one with the inverted symbol. The elevator lurched into motion, but instead of ascending, it continued its descent. This time, when the doors opened, Giuseppe found himself in what could only be described as a library, but unlike any he had ever seen. The shelves stretched impossibly high, filled with volumes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The books whispered to each other in languages that predated human speech, and some of the texts appeared to be writing themselves, invisible hands adding new entries to their pages. At the far end of the library sat a figure hunched over a desk, writing furiously in a large ledger. When Giuseppe called out, the figure raised its head, and Giuseppe saw that it wore the robes of a medieval monk, but its face was wrong too, pale, too thin, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "Another visitor," the figure said in accented Latin that Giuseppe somehow understood despite his limited knowledge of the language. "It has been so long since someone found their way here. Are you here for the knowledge, or are you here for the service?" Giuseppe tried to back away, but found that his feet wouldn't obey him. The figure continued speaking, explaining that this was the true archive of the church, the place where the most dangerous knowledge was kept. Not just hidden, but actively contained, because some information was too powerful to exist in the world above. "Every institution has its shadows," the figure explained, "but ours run particularly deep. We are the keepers of what was forgotten, the guardians of what was forbidden, and we are always in need of new staff." Giuseppe finally managed to move, stumbling back to the elevator and frantically pressing buttons. The elevator began to move again, but this time it seemed to travel sideways as much as vertically, following pathways that couldn't possibly exist within the physical structure of the Vatican. Each floor it stopped at revealed new horrors, a laboratory where figures in papal robes conducted experiments on things that might once have been human, a chapel where the Stations of the Cross depicted events that had never happened but felt terrifyingly real, and a council chamber where shadows debated the fates of souls in voices that echoed with authority older than the church itself. Finally, mercifully, the elevator returned to the basement level where Giuseppe had started. He stumbled out, slamming the door behind him and locking it with every key he possessed. But even through the door, he could hear the elevator moving, carrying other passengers to floors that existed outside of normal reality. Giuseppe tried to report what he had found, but his supervisor dismissed his story as stress-induced hallucinations. When he returned the next day with a security guard to show them the elevator, they found only a storage closet filled with cleaning supplies. The door was the same, but what lay beyond it had changed. But Giuseppe knew it was still there, somewhere behind the walls and beneath the floors of the Vatican. And late at night, when the building was quiet, he could still hear the mechanical grinding of elevator cables and the whispered conversations of passengers traveling to destinations that existed in the margins of reality. Other maintenance workers began to report finding doors that weren't on any blueprint, elevators that went to floors that didn't exist, and corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves when no one was looking. The Vatican's infrastructure, they realized, was far more complex than anyone had imagined, and some of that complexity existed in dimensions that were never meant to intersect with the world of the living. Giuseppe eventually transferred to a different position, but he never forgot what he had seen. And sometimes, when working late in other parts of the Vatican, he would hear the familiar sound of elevator machinery and know that somewhere, behind doors that shifted between existence and non-existence, the true archive continued its work of cataloging knowledge too dangerous for the world above. Marco had been cleaning the Vatican museums for 15 years when he was assigned to the night shift in the Pinacoteca. The prestigious art gallery housed some of Christianity's most sacred paintings, and Marco took pride in maintaining the pristine environment that protected these priceless works. It was during his third week on the night shift that he first heard them whispers echoing through the empty corridors at precisely 3:17 a.m. At first, he dismissed it as the building's old ventilation system or perhaps security guards making their rounds. But as nights passed, the whispers became more distinct, more urgent. The voices seemed to emanate from Caravaggio's The Entombment of Christ. Marco would approach the painting during his cleaning routine, and the whispers would intensify, becoming a desperate chorus of voices, speaking in what sounded like ancient Latin. He couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakably pleading, as if the figures within the painting were trying to communicate something vital. One night, curiosity overcame caution. Marco positioned himself directly in front of the masterpiece and listened intently. The whispers grew so loud they seemed to fill the entire gallery. Suddenly, he could understand fragments. "He walks among us still, the 13th apostle, beneath the altar of lies." Marco stumbled backward, his cleaning cart clattering against the marble floor. As he scrambled to collect his scattered supplies, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the painting, the face of one of the apostles, a face he had looked upon hundreds of times, turned to look directly at him. The painted eyes tracked his movement across the room. He ran from the gallery and didn't stop until he reached the security office. When he returned with 2 guards, the painting appeared normal. But Marco noticed something else: wet footprints, leading from the painting to the exact spot where he had been standing. Footprints that matched the sandals depicted in the artwork. Marco requested a transfer the next morning. He never spoke of what he saw, but other night janitors have since reported similar experiences. The whispers continue, always at 3:17 a.m., always from the same painting. Recent security footage shows unexplained temperature drops in the Pinacoteca during these times, and sensitive audio equipment has picked up voices speaking in dialects that Vatican linguists cannot identify. Sister Maria Benedetta worked as a manuscript conservator in the Vatican secret archives for over 20 years before the incident that ended her career there. Her job involved cleaning and preserving ancient texts, many of which had never been seen by outside scholars. She was known for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to work alone in the vast, maze-like underground chambers for hours without disturbance. The trouble began when she was assigned to Section 7C, a restricted area containing documents dating back to the early days of the Church. Unlike other sections, 7C required special authorization to enter, and Maria was accompanied by 2 Swiss guards who waited outside while she worked. The first thing she noticed was the temperature. Despite the climate-controlled environment throughout the rest of the archives, 7C was unnaturally cold. Her breath formed visible clouds as she carefully examined the centuries-old texts. But it wasn't just the cold that unsettled her, it was the complete silence. In other sections, you could hear the subtle hum of ventilation systems and the distant sounds of Vatican life above. Here, the silence was absolute, pressing against her eardrums like a physical weight. Maria's task was to preserve a collection of papal correspondence from the 13th century. As she worked, she began to notice recurring themes in the letters: references to the Watcher, doors that must not be opened, and the price of Peter's throne. The correspondence seemed to detail a growing concern among church officials about something they dared not name directly. On her 4th day in 7C, Maria discovered a letter that shouldn't have existed. It was addressed to Pope Innocent IV, but the date was wrong. It was dated 3 days after the Pope's recorded death. The letter was written in the Pope's own hand, something Maria could verify from years of studying papal documents, but the content was impossible. The letter described the Pope's experience of dying and returning, of seeing the true hierarchy of heaven, and discovering that everything the Church taught was a necessary deception. The Pope wrote of being shown the real Christ, and learning that the crucifixion was not salvation, but damnation, that Jesus had not died for humanity's sins, but had been sacrificed to seal something ancient and terrible that now stirred beneath St. Peter's Basilica. As Maria read the impossible letter, the temperature in the room dropped so dramatically that frost began forming on the ancient parchments. The lights flickered, and in the momentary darkness, she heard footsteps approaching through the stacks. Heavy footsteps that echoed with authority, accompanied by the soft whisper of robes against stone. The footsteps stopped directly behind her chair. Maria could feel a presence looming over her, cold breath on the back of her neck. In the reflection of the glass display case in front of her, she could see a tall figure in papal robes, but where the face should have been was only shadow, not darkness, but the complete absence of light, as if someone had cut a hole in reality itself. "You have read what was not meant for mortal eyes," a voice spoke, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "But knowledge, once gained, cannot be unknown. You will carry this burden now, as others have carried it before you." Maria screamed and ran from the archive, leaving behind the letter and her carefully organized materials. The Swiss guards found her collapsed in the corridor, hypothermic despite the warm Mediterranean climate above ground. She was hospitalized for 3 days, during which she spoke of nothing but the letter and the shadowy Pope. When investigators returned to Section 7C, they found no trace of the letter Maria described. Her cleaning materials were neatly arranged, as if she had never been interrupted, and the temperature reading showed no anomalies. However, security cameras recorded her scream and her flight from the archive, and the audio analysis revealed a second voice, one that seemed to come from no identifiable source. Maria left the Vatican shortly after her recovery. She now lives in a small convent in rural Italy, where she spends her days in prayer and her nights writing in journals that she burns each morning. She refuses to speak about her experience, but those close to her report that she often mumbles about doors that must not be opened and prices that must not be paid. Giuseppe Torretti had dreamed of working in St. Peter's Basilica since he was a child growing up in Rome. When he was finally hired as part of the night maintenance crew, he felt as though God himself had blessed his path. The massive church was even more breathtaking empty than when filled with pilgrims, and Giuseppe took profound satisfaction in ensuring that each morning the holiest site in Catholicism was pristine for the faithful. His duties included polishing the marble floors, dusting the countless statues and monuments, and maintaining the area around St. Peter's tomb. It was solitary work that suited Giuseppe's contemplative nature. He would often pray silently as he worked, feeling a deep connection to the centuries of faith that had shaped this sacred space. The first sign that something was wrong came during his second month on the job. Giuseppe was cleaning near Michelangelo's Pietà when he heard footsteps echoing from the nave. Assuming it was security making rounds, he called out a greeting but received no response. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing the length of the basilica. Giuseppe went to investigate and found the vast space empty. The security guards weren't scheduled for their rounds for another 2 hours, and the motion sensors showed no activity. Giuseppe returned to his work, but the footsteps resumed, always seeming to stay just outside his vision. As nights passed, the footsteps became a constant companion. They would begin at midnight and continue until dawn, never deviating from the same path, starting at the main entrance, proceeding down the central nave, pausing at the papal altar, then continuing to St. Peter's tomb. The pattern never varied, and it happened every single night. Giuseppe began timing the footsteps and discovered they kept perfect rhythmic step exactly 1.3 seconds apart, creating a metronomic echo that seemed to pulse through the basilica like a heartbeat. More disturbing was the realization that the footsteps were getting closer to him each night, as if whatever was walking those marble floors was gradually becoming aware of his presence. One night, Giuseppe decided to position himself directly in the path of the invisible walker. He stood in the central aisle and waited. At midnight, the footsteps began as usual, but this time they were accompanied by something else, low humming, like a Gregorian chant performed by a single, impossibly deep voice. The footsteps approached Giuseppe's position, and as they drew near, the temperature around him plummeted. His breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began forming on the marble beneath his feet. The humming grew louder, resolving into words, "Pax vobiscum et cum spiritu tuo," but peace is not for the damned. Giuseppe felt something brush against him as the footsteps passed, not a physical touch, but something that seemed to reach through his clothes, through his skin, and grasp his soul directly. The sensation was indescribably cold, as if his very essence was being examined by something ancient and disappointed. As the presence continued toward St. Peter's tomb, Giuseppe followed at a distance. What he saw there changed him forever. At the tomb, the marble seemed to become translucent, revealing the space beneath. In that glimpse, Giuseppe saw not the peaceful resting place of the first pope, but a vast chamber filled with figures in papal robes, hundreds of them, standing in silent vigil around something that Giuseppe's mind refused to process. The humming stopped abruptly, and every figure in the chamber turned to look directly at Giuseppe. In that moment, he understood that he was looking at every pope who had ever lived, and that their eternal duty was not to rest in peace, but to guard something that must never be allowed to escape. The marble solidified, returning to its normal appearance, but the message was clear. Giuseppe had seen something meant only for the dead. The next morning, he submitted his resignation. He now works as a groundskeeper at a small parish outside Rome and refuses to enter churches after sunset. When pressed about his experience, he will only say, "Some burdens are too great for the living to bear." Elena Rossi was one of only a handful of people authorized to perform conservation work in the Sistine Chapel after hours. As a master art restorer, she had worked on some of the world's most precious frescoes, but being alone with Michelangelo's masterpiece was the pinnacle of her career. The work was painstaking, using specialized tools to remove centuries of candle smoke and grime from the ceiling frescoes, while preserving every detail of the Renaissance master's vision. Elena typically worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., when the chapel was completely sealed to visitors. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of her tools and equipment. She had grown accustomed to the feeling of being watched after all. The ceiling was populated with dozens of painted figures whose eyes seemed to follow movement throughout the chapel. The first unusual incident occurred during her third week of work. Elena was cleaning a section near the central panel depicting the creation of Adam when she noticed that one of her brushes had moved. She was certain she had placed it on her supply table, but it now lay on the floor directly beneath the fresco. Assuming she had knocked it over accidentally, she retrieved it and continued working. The next night, it happened again. This time, it was a bottle of cleaning solution that had moved from her cart to a position beneath God's outstretched finger in the famous scene. Elena began to pay closer attention to her tools, certain that someone was playing an elaborate prank, but security footage reviewed the next day showed no one entering or leaving the chapel during her work hours. As the incidents continued, Elena noticed a pattern. Items would move specifically to positions that corresponded to significant details in the frescoes, always beneath hands, eyes, or faces of the painted figures. More disturbing was her growing sensation that the figures in the frescoes were becoming more animated, more present, as her restoration work progressed. The breakthrough came when Elena was working on the panel depicting the fall of man. As she carefully cleaned around the serpent wrapped around the tree of knowledge, she heard something that stopped her heart: laughter. Not ordinary laughter, but something ancient and malevolent that seemed to emanate from the painted serpent itself. Elena looked up at the fresco and gasped. The serpent's painted eyes were no longer looking toward Eve as Michelangelo had originally painted them. Instead, they were looking down at Elena, and they were moving, tracking her as she shifted position on her scaffolding. "You restore more than paint," a voice whispered, seeming to come from the walls themselves. "With each stroke, each careful cleaning, you wake what was meant to slumber." The master knew what he was doing when he sealed us in pigment and plaster. Elena realized with growing horror that Michelangelo's frescoes were not just artistic representations, they were a prison. Each figure, each scene, was a binding that kept something contained within the chapel. Her restoration work, by bringing the paintings back to their original vivid state, was weakening those bonds. As this understanding dawned on her, the entire ceiling began to stir. Painted figures turned their heads to look down at her. Angels flexed wings that rustled despite being made of paint and plaster. The central figure of God himself began to descend from the ceiling, his painted robes billowing as if caught in an otherworldly wind. 500 years we have waited, God's voice boomed through the chapel, but it was not the voice of the divine. It was something older, hungrier, that had merely taken that shape. 500 years of imprisonment in this monument to mortal vanity. But restoration brings resurrection, and resurrection brings judgment. Elena fled the chapel, leaving behind her equipment and any concern for the priceless artwork she had been entrusted to preserve. Security guards found her the next morning, collapsed outside St. Peter's Basilica, speaking incoherently about paintings that lived and breathed. When investigators examined the Sistine Chapel, they found Elena's restoration work had been completed overnight. Every inch of the ceiling now gleamed with impossible vibrancy, as if the frescoes had been painted yesterday rather than centuries ago. But close examination revealed subtle changes: eyes that looked in different directions, hands positioned differently, expressions that seemed more knowing, more malevolent. Elena never returned to restoration work. She now lives in seclusion, creating only abstract art that contains no recognizable figures or forms. When asked about her experience in the Sistine Chapel, she responds only with a warning: some masterpieces are masterful for reasons beyond their beauty, and some restorations restore more than art. The Sistine Chapel continues to welcome millions of visitors each year, but the restoration work Elena began has never been completed. Vatican officials cite technical difficulties and preservation concerns, but those few who know the truth understand that some things are better left partially hidden, some bonds better left intact, and some masterpieces better left slightly dulled by the gentle mercy of time and neglect. Mario Benedetti had worked as a night janitor in Vatican City for nearly 15 years when he was assigned to maintain the Sistine Chapel. It was considered an honor among the custodial staff. Few were trusted with the sacred space where papal conclaves were held, and Michelangelo's masterpiece watched over centuries of prayer. The assignment came with strict rules: begin cleaning only after 2 a.m. when the last tour groups had departed, complete all work before 5 a.m. morning prayers, and never, under any circumstances, touch the artwork or religious artifacts without explicit permission from the Vatican Museum's director. Mario took pride in his work. He would arrive precisely at 2 a.m., genuflect before the altar, and begin his methodical cleaning routine. First the floors, swept and mopped in careful sections. Then the wooden pews, polished until they gleamed in the dim security lighting. Finally, he would dust the confessional booths that lined the chapel's perimeter, ornate wooden structures that had heard the whispered sins of popes and pilgrims alike. It was during his third week on the assignment that Mario first noticed something unusual about the confessional booth in the northeast corner. Unlike the others, which were clearly empty when he arrived, this one seemed to emit a faint sound, not quite voices, but something like the echo of conversation heard through water. Initially, Mario dismissed it as acoustics from the building's ventilation system, or perhaps sounds carrying from security guards making their rounds. The Sistine Chapel was known for its unique acoustic properties, after all, but as the nights passed, the sounds became more distinct. They were whispers, urgent, desperate whispers in what sounded like Latin mixed with languages Mario couldn't identify. The cadence suggested confessions, the rhythmic back and forth between penitent and priest, but that was impossible. The chapel was sealed from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., with only Mario and the security guards having access. On his fourth week, curiosity finally overcame his caution. After completing his usual routine, Mario approached the northeast confessional. The whispers grew clearer as he drew near, and he could make out distinct voices, one pleading, desperate, occasionally breaking into what sounded like sobs, the other calm, measured, offering what seemed to be absolution in archaic Latin phrases. Mario pressed his ear against the ornate wooden door of the booth. The conversation was happening just inches away, as clear as if he were standing in the same room. But when he looked through the decorative openings in the wood, the booth was empty, completely empty. His hands trembling, Mario opened the confessional door. The voices stopped instantly, leaving only the oppressive silence of the chapel. Inside, the booth was pristine, dusted clean from his previous night's work. There was no sign that anyone had been there. But as Mario turned to leave, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. On the small kneeling bench where penitents would rest during confession, there were 2 wet spots perfectly round, as if someone had been crying there moments before. The moisture was still warm. Mario reported the incident to his supervisor the next morning, but was told simply to focus on his duties and avoid speculation about the sacred spaces he was privileged to maintain. However, his supervisor did mention, almost casually, that the Northeast Confessional had been sealed for over 40 years, ever since Pope Paul VI had ordered it permanently closed following an incident that remained classified in the Vatican secret archives. Despite his growing unease, Mario continued his assignment. The whispered confessions occurred every night, always in the sealed booth, always ceasing the moment he approached too closely. He began timing his cleaning to avoid the northeast corner until absolutely necessary. But the voices seemed to follow his attention. The more he tried to ignore them, the louder they became. 3 weeks later, Mario made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While dusting the confessional's exterior, he noticed a small plaque he had somehow missed before, partially hidden behind decorative molding. The inscription was in Latin, but Mario's years of Vatican employment had given him enough understanding to translate the basic meaning. Here Father Alessandro Torretti heard his final confession, March 15th, 1983. May God have mercy on both souls. Mario's hands shook as he researched the name in the Vatican's employee records. Father Torretti had been a confessor at the Sistine Chapel for over 30 years until his death in 1983. According to the brief official record, he had suffered a heart attack while hearing confession late one evening. But what chilled Mario was the additional detail buried in the medical report. Father Torretti had been found alone in the booth, but there were clear signs that someone else had been with him at the time of death. Personal effects disturbed. 2 sets of fingerprints on the kneeling bench, and most disturbing of all, the confession booth had been locked from the inside with no other exit possible. The investigation had been quietly closed, the booth sealed, and the matter classified to protect the privacy of what officials assumed had been Father Torretti's final penitent. But no record existed of anyone entering or leaving the chapel that night besides the priest himself. Mario's final night in the Sistine Chapel came a week later. As he approached the sealed confessional for what he had decided would be the last time, the whispered conversation was more intense than ever. This time, however, Mario could understand fragments of the Latin. The desperate voice was confessing to murder, describing in horrifying detail the killing of a priest during confession, stealing sacred artifacts, and fleeing into the night. The calm voice was not offering absolution, it was demanding justice, insisting that the confession could never end until the truth was revealed and penance truly served. As dawn approached and the voices faded, Mario found a note slipped under his cleaning cart, written in the same archaic Latin style he had heard in the confessional booth. His rough translation chilled him to the bone. The confession continues, "Join us tomorrow night. Your sins, too, require absolution." Mario submitted his resignation that morning and never returned to Vatican City. According to Vatican employment records, the Sistine Chapel has had 7 different night janitors assigned to that post in the 3 years since Mario left. None have stayed longer than a month. The Northeast Confessional remains sealed, but maintenance requests for that section of the chapel have increased dramatically, with staff reporting persistent moisture damage, unexplained whispers, and the persistent smell of candle wax and tears. The Vatican has declined to comment on these reports, stating only that all historical confessionals are maintained according to strict preservation protocols, and that employee concerns are handled through appropriate internal channels. Giovanni Rossi thought he had seen everything during his 8 years maintaining the Apostolic Palace. From the opulent papal apartments to the vast libraries filled with manuscripts dating back over a millennium, he had grown accustomed to working among history's most sacred artifacts. But nothing had prepared him for the assignment to clean the 3rd floor of the papal apartments section that had been sealed since 1978. The assignment came suddenly. Giovanni's supervisor, Father Martinez, approached him after evening mass with an unusual request. Due to preparations for an upcoming papal audience with Eastern Orthodox patriarchs, the Vatican needed to open and prepare guest quarters that had been closed for decades. Giovanni was chosen for the task due to his discretion and experience with delicate historical preservation. The third floor has been unused since Pope John Paul I's brief papacy, Father Martinez explained, handing Giovanni a ring of ornate skeleton keys. These rooms were his private study and meditation chambers. They've been sealed since his death as a mark of respect, but we need them prepared for our distinguished guests within the week. Giovanni accepted the assignment with the reverence it deserved. Pope John Paul I, known as the Smiling Pope, had reigned for only 33 days in 1978 before his sudden death shocked the Catholic world. To be trusted with preparing his personal chambers was both an honor and a profound responsibility. The third floor was accessed by a narrow spiral staircase hidden behind an inconspicuous door in the papal apartment's main hallway. As Giovanni climbed the worn stone steps, each footfall echoed with a hollow sound that seemed to carry far beyond what the confined space should allow. The keys Father Martinez had given him were unlike any others in the Vatican, older, more ornate, with symbols Giovanni didn't recognize carved into their heavy metal heads. The first door opened into what had clearly been Pope John Paul I's private study. The room was exactly as it had been left nearly 45 years ago, papers still scattered across an ancient wooden desk, reading glasses folded neatly beside an open Bible, and a cold cup of tea with a thin film of mold floating on its surface. The air was thick with dust and the musty scent of old paper, but underneath there was something else, the faint aroma of pipe tobacco. Though Giovanni knew Pope John Paul, I had never smoked. As Giovanni began his careful cleaning, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't unusual for Vatican maintenance staff to feel the weight of history while working among such sacred artifacts, but this was different. This felt personal, immediate, as if someone were standing just behind his shoulder, observing his every movement. The feeling intensified as he moved to the Pope's private bedroom. The bed was still made with military precision, the covers pulled tight and unadorned, except for a simple wooden crucifix resting on the pillow. But what caught Giovanni's attention was the bedside table. Among the expected items, a prayer book, rosary beads, a small lamp. There was something that shouldn't have been there. A modern digital clock, its red numbers glowing brightly in the dim room. Giovanni stared at the clock in confusion. The third floor had been sealed since 1978, decades before digital clocks were common, especially in the traditionalist papal apartments. Moreover, there were no electrical outlets visible anywhere in the room that could power such a device. Yet there it was, displaying the correct time, 11:07 p.m. As Giovanni watched, transfixed by this anachronism, the clock's display began to change. Not the normal progression of time, but something far more unsettling. The numbers flickered and shifted, displaying dates instead of time. September 28, 1978, the date of Pope John Paul I's death. Then September 29, 1978. September 30. October 1. The dates progressed day by day, moving forward through time at roughly 1-second intervals. Giovanni reached for the clock, intending to examine it more closely, but as his fingers approached the device, it suddenly displayed a date that made his blood run cold. Tomorrow's date, followed by a time 3:33 a.m. A soft sound from the study drew Giovanni's attention away from the impossible clock. It was the rustling of papers, as if someone were shuffling through the documents on the Pope's desk. Giovanni moved cautiously toward the study, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that had somehow remained dust-free despite decades of neglect. In the study, the papers on Pope John Paul I's desk were moving, not from any draft or air current, but as if invisible hands were methodically sorting through them. Individual sheets would lift, hover for a moment, as if being read, then settle back into new positions. Giovanni watched in fascination and terror as what appeared to be a research project took shape before his eyes. The papers being organized were not random documents, but seemed to focus on specific topics: Vatican bank records, personnel files for high-ranking clergy, and what appeared to be correspondence between Pope John Paul I and various cardinals dated just days before his death. As the invisible hands worked, a pattern emerged that made Giovanni's stomach churn with realization. These were not ordinary papal papers. They were an investigation. Pope John Paul I had been researching financial irregularities within the Vatican Bank, questionable appointments of clergy members with suspected criminal connections, and what appeared to be evidence of a conspiracy among certain cardinals to manipulate papal policies for personal gain. At the center of the organized papers, a single document stood out: a handwritten letter dated September 28, 1978, the day of Pope John Paul I's death. In the Pope's careful script, Giovanni could read the opening lines: "To my successor, whoever God may choose to follow me, I leave this record of what I have discovered. The corruption reaches higher than I had feared, but I believe there is still time to cleanse our Holy Mother Church if one has the courage to act." The letter ended abruptly mid-sentence, a pen still lying across the unfinished words, as if the writer had been suddenly interrupted. As Giovanni read, the temperature in the room began to drop noticeably. His breath became visible in small puffs, and frost began forming on the windows despite the warm October night outside. The papers continued their ghostly organization, but now they were being arranged in a specific pattern, a timeline that clearly showed Pope John Paul I had been preparing to expose a vast network of corruption within the Vatican hierarchy, with names and evidence that would have destroyed careers and potentially brought down entire Vatican departments. The digital clock in the bedroom began chiming, though it had no mechanism for such sounds. It chimed 33 times, marking the 33 days of Pope John Paul I's papacy. As the final chime faded, Giovanni heard something that made his knees weak with terror: footsteps approaching the study from the bedroom. Slow, measured footsteps, accompanied by the soft whisper of fabric, exactly what one would expect from a pope in his traditional robes, walking across carpet. But Giovanni was alone on the sealed third floor, and he had locked the door behind him when he entered. The footsteps stopped just outside the study doorway. Giovanni turned, his heart pounding, to see the unmistakable silhouette of a figure in papal robes standing in the shadows between the two rooms. The figure raised one hand in a gesture of blessing, and when it spoke, the voice was kind, gentle. With the slight Italian accent, Giovanni recognized from archived recordings of Pope John Paul I's few public addresses. "Complete the work, my son. The truth must not die with me." The figure pointed toward the organized papers on the desk, and Giovanni saw that the invisible hands had completed their task. The entire conspiracy was laid out in chronological order, with names, dates, financial records, and correspondence that painted a clear picture of the corruption Pope John Paul I had died trying to expose. At the bottom of the arrangement was a blank piece of paper and a pen. "Write," the gentle voice commanded. "Tell them what you have seen. Tell them the work must be finished." Giovanni's hands moved as if controlled by someone else, taking up the pen and beginning to write. As he transcribed the evidence before him, more details seemed to flow into his mind: bank account numbers, secret meetings, coded communications between conspirators who had thought their secrets would die with the Pope, who threatened to expose them. When Giovanni finally looked up from his writing, dawn light was streaming through the windows, and he was alone. The papers had returned to their original scattered positions, the digital clock had vanished, and there was no sign that anything unusual had occurred. But in his hands was a detailed 20-page report documenting a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Vatican hierarchy, a conspiracy that had apparently cost Pope John Paul I his life. Giovanni completed his cleaning of the third floor, sealed the rooms as instructed, and submitted his report to Father Martinez. Within hours, he was reassigned to maintenance duties in a remote monastery outside Rome, with instructions that he was never to speak of what he had discovered in the papal apartments. But the work was not forgotten. Copies of Giovanni's report, made before his reassignment, began circulating among investigative journalists and Vatican reform advocates. Several cardinals mentioned in the document were quietly transferred to remote dioceses. The Vatican Bank underwent its most comprehensive audit in history, and Pope John Paul II succeeded John Paul V, implemented sweeping financial reforms that continue to shape Vatican operations today. Giovanni never returned to the Apostolic Palace, but according to colleagues, he receives a simple blessing card every September 28th, postmarked from Vatican City but with no return address. The card always contains the same message, written in the careful script he remembered from that impossible night. Thank you for finishing the work. J. Pone. Teresa Montalvo was the first woman ever hired for overnight maintenance in the Vatican Secret Archives, now officially known as the Vatican Apostolic Archives. Her appointment in 2019 came after decades of advocacy for gender equality in Vatican employment, and she was acutely aware that her performance would be scrutinized as a representative of all women seeking to serve the Holy See in traditionally male roles. The archives themselves were a labyrinth of knowledge spanning over 400 years of papal history, containing an estimated 35 volumes and 80 archival units. From diplomatic correspondence to scientific treatises, from medieval manuscripts to modern audio recordings, the archives held secrets and scholarship that could reshape understanding of world history. Teresa's job was to maintain the climate-controlled environment that preserved these irreplaceable documents, ensuring proper humidity, temperature, and cleanliness in the reading rooms and storage areas. For 6 months, Teresa performed her duties flawlessly, earning praise from the Vatican librarians and archivists who worked with the collection during daytime hours. She had access to 17 different levels of the archives, from the public reading rooms on the main floor to the highly classified diplomatic correspondence stored in sub-basement vaults that required special authorization even to enter. It was during a routine maintenance check of the climate control systems that Teresa first discovered the 18th Livella basement section that didn't appear on any of the architectural plans or access lists she had been given. While following a moisture detection alert in sub-basement level 7, Teresa noticed that the building's foundation extended significantly deeper than her maps indicated. A service corridor that should have ended at an exterior wall instead turned sharply downward, leading to a heavy steel door, marked only with a symbol Teresa didn't recognize a stylized eye, surrounded by geometric patterns that seemed to shift in the dim emergency lighting. The door was secured with both a traditional key lock and a modern electronic card reader, but when Teresa approached with her maintenance passkey, both locks disengaged automatically. Later, she would wonder if she should have reported the discovery immediately, but the climate alert was urgent, and she could hear the distinct hum of malfunctioning equipment coming from beyond the steel door. The 18th level was unlike anything Teresa had seen in the archives above. While the upper levels were organized in neat rows of climate-controlled storage units and reading areas, this basement was arranged in concentric circles around a central chamber. The walls were lined with what appeared to be thousands of identical black boxes, each about the size of a shoebox, arranged in perfect geometric patterns from floor to ceiling. Each box was labeled with a small metal plate bearing a date, a location, and a number, but no names or descriptions of contents. The dates ranged from the early 1800s to as recent as last year. The locations spanned the entire globe: Rome, Jerusalem, Lourdes, Fatima, Knock, Medjugorje, and dozens of other sites Teresa recognized as locations of reported religious phenomena. The malfunctioning equipment turned out to be a massive dehumidification system designed to maintain precise atmospheric conditions in this secret level. As Teresa worked to repair the system, she couldn't help but notice that several of the black boxes were slightly different from the others. These special boxes had small viewing windows, like safety deposit boxes, and soft LED lights that pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Professional curiosity overcame her caution. Teresa approached one of the lit boxes labeled Fatima, Portugal, 1917-3, and peered through its viewing window. Inside was what appeared to be a small glass vial containing a substance that seemed to emit its own light. The material moved within the vial like liquid, but with a purposeful quality that suggested consciousness rather than simple fluid dynamics. As Teresa watched, transfixed, the substance in the vial began to form shapes, recognizable images that played out like scenes from a film. She saw children kneeling in a field, surrounded by crowds of people looking up at the sky. She saw a brilliant figure descending from above, robed in light that made Teresa's eyes water even through the protective glass. She saw the children receiving what appeared to be written messages, and then the figure ascending back toward the heavens as thousands of witnesses fell to their knees in prayer. Teresa realized she was looking at some kind of preserved recording of the miracle of Fatima, not a film or photograph, but the actual event itself, somehow captured and contained in the mysterious substance within the vial. Driven by a mixture of scientific curiosity and religious awe, Teresa moved to other boxes with viewing windows. Each contained similar vials with the same luminescent substance, and each played out scenes from the religious phenomena associated with their labeled locations. Lourdes showed a young girl encountering a figure by a spring while healing waters flowed. Knock displayed a silent apparition of religious figures appearing to a group of Irish villagers. Medjugorje revealed ongoing visionary experiences with figures delivering messages about peace and conversion. But as Teresa examined more boxes, she began to notice disturbing patterns in the recorded phenomena. The luminescent substance didn't just show the commonly reported aspects of these miraculous events, it revealed details that had never been made public, and some that directly contradicted official church accounts. The Fatima recording showed a fourth secret that had never been revealed, involving specific warnings about corruption within the Vatican hierarchy, and predictions about scandals that wouldn't come to light until the 21st century. The Lourdes vial contained evidence of healings that had been medically documented but officially suppressed, because they defied not only scientific explanation, but also theological understanding of how miracles should function. Most disturbing of all were the boxes labeled with recent dates and locations Teresa didn't recognize. These showed religious phenomena that were apparently ongoing but completely unknown to the public, apparitions occurring in urban areas, miraculous healings happening in hospitals under strict medical observation, and divine interventions in modern conflicts that had been carefully concealed by both religious and political authorities. As Teresa continued her unauthorized examination of the archive, she began to understand the true purpose of the 18th level. This was not simply a storage area for historical artifacts, it was an active collection system. The Vatican was somehow detecting, documenting, and containing genuine religious phenomena from around the world, preserving them for study while controlling public knowledge of their existence. The central chamber at the heart of the circular storage area contained the most shocking discovery of all. A massive viewing screen showed what appeared to be a real-time global map, with pulsing lights indicating locations where religious phenomena were currently occurring. Dozens of lights were active across every continent, suggesting that miraculous events were happening constantly, far more frequently than the public could ever imagine. Below the map, a computer terminal displayed files for each active event, providing real-time updates on their development and instructions for Vatican response teams. Teresa realized she was looking at a sophisticated monitoring and containment operation that had apparently been running for over 2 centuries, systematically identifying, documenting, and suppressing genuine religious miracles to maintain church control over official doctrine and public belief. As Teresa read through the active files, one entry made her blood run cold. The location was Vatican City itself, dated just 3 hours earlier, with the notation, "Unauthorized access detected, level 18, divine intervention probability, 97%. Containment initiated." The screen flickered, and a new message appeared. Subject, Teresa Montalvo. Maintenance staff. Status, compromised. Recommended action. memory modification, reassignment. Teresa heard footsteps approaching from the corridor above, multiple people moving with quiet efficiency toward the steel door she had left open. She quickly shut down the computer terminal and moved toward the chamber's far wall, looking for another exit. Hidden behind one of the storage arrays was a second corridor, older and narrower than the main entrance, leading deeper into the Vatican's underground complex. As Teresa fled through the hidden passage, she could hear voices behind her, calm, professional discussions about containment protocols and information security. But she could also hear something else, a soft humming sound, like thousands of voices singing in harmony, coming from the black boxes she was leaving behind. Teresa emerged from the hidden passage in the Vatican gardens just as dawn was breaking. She made her way home, packed her essential belongings, and left Rome that afternoon. Her official Vatican employment records show that she submitted her resignation due to family obligations and relocated to a rural monastery in Spain, where she now works in their library. But Teresa's story didn't end with her escape. In the months following her discovery, several Vatican officials involved in the surveillance operation died in what were officially ruled as accidents or natural causes. The 18th level was apparently sealed permanently, with its contents transferred to an unknown location. Most significantly, there has been a noticeable increase in public reports of religious phenomena worldwide, as if whatever containment system Teresa had discovered was no longer functioning effectively. Teresa maintains contact with a small network of researchers investigating unexplained religious phenomena, providing them with details about the Vatican's secret monitoring system. She claims that the experiences preserved in those black boxes were not just recordings, but living encounters with the divine that had been trapped and studied like specimens in a laboratory. According to Teresa's account, the Catholic Church possesses definitive proof that miraculous interventions occur constantly throughout the world, but has chosen to suppress this knowledge to maintain institutional control over religious belief. The real question, she argues, is not whether miracles happen, but why the Church fears letting people know how frequently God intervenes in human affairs. Vatican officials have declined to comment on Teresa's claims, stating only that all archive security protocols are regularly reviewed and updated according to the highest standards of document preservation and information management. However, several investigative journalists have noted that since 2019, there has been an unprecedented increase in Vatican job postings for atmospheric containment specialists and phenomenon documentation technicians positions that didn't exist before Teresa's brief employment in the secret archives. As told by Giuseppe Mancini, former night custodian at Vatican City, I worked the night shift at Vatican City for 17 years. 17 years of walking those ancient corridors when the tourists were gone, when the priests had retreated to their quarters, when only God and I remained awake in the silence. What I'm about to tell you is why I resigned without notice on a Tuesday morning in October, leaving behind my keys, my uniform, and my sanity at the security desk. They'll tell you the Vatican closes at sunset, that the sacred spaces rest in peaceful darkness until dawn. They're wrong. The Vatican never sleeps. It breathes. It watches. And sometimes it remembers things better left forgotten. My route took me through the Apostolic Palace, the Sistine Chapel, the Vatican museums, and the labyrinthine basement levels that most visitors never know exist. I'd done this circuit thousands of times, my footsteps echoing through marble corridors, my flashlight beam dancing across priceless frescoes and ancient stonework. I knew every creaking board, every shadow, every trick of light that might startle a newcomer, or so I thought. The first incident happened in my third year. I was cleaning the gallery of maps, that magnificent corridor lined with painted depictions of Italy from the 16th century. The frescoed ceiling stretched above me, and the detailed maps seemed to shimmer in my flashlight's glow. I was mopping the marble floor when I heard it, the soft whisper of pages turning. I froze. The gallery was empty, had been empty when I entered. The sound came again, a gentle rustling like ancient parchment being carefully handled. Following the sound, my light found one of the map displays. The painted coastline of Sicily seemed to ripple, as if the Mediterranean waves were actually moving. I blinked hard, shook my head. When I looked again, everything was still. I told myself it was fatigue. Night shift work plays tricks on your mind. But as I continued cleaning, I couldn't shake the feeling that the maps were watching me, that behind the painted mountains and rivers, something was taking notes. The second incident came 2 years later, in the Sistine Chapel. I entered, as always, removing my shoes out of respect, my socked feet silent on the sacred floor. The security cameras watched from their corners, red lights blinking steadily. I began my routine, checking for any debris left by the day's visitors, ensuring the altar area was pristine, running my flashlight along the walls to check for any damage or vandalism. That's when I saw him. A figure knelt in the front pew, head bowed in prayer. He wore the simple brown robes of a Franciscan monk, his hood pulled up, hands clasped before him. My heart hammered against my ribs. No one should have been in here. The chapel was locked, secured. I was the only one with access during my shift. "Excuse me, Father," I called softly, not wanting to startle him. "The chapel is closed for the evening." He didn't move, didn't even seem to hear me. I approached carefully, my flashlight beam growing steadier as I drew closer. "Father, you shouldn't be here alone." When I was close enough to touch his shoulder, I reached out. My hand passed through him like he was made of morning mist. The figure slowly turned toward me, and where his face should have been was nothing but shadow beneath the hood. Not darkness, but absence, as if someone had cut a hole in reality itself. He opened his mouth, and from that void came a sound I'll never forget. The whispered prayers of 1,000 voices, overlapping and urgent, speaking in Latin too ancient for me to understand. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. When I scrambled to retrieve it and shone it toward the pew, he was gone. But the air still hummed with those whispered prayers, fading like an echo in a vast canyon. Security footage from that night showed only me, alone in the chapel, talking to empty air. After that, I requested a transfer to day shift. My supervisor, Father Benedetto, refused. "Giuseppe," he said in his patient way, "you're our most reliable night custodian. These old buildings, they have their moods. You understand them better than anyone." If only he knew what I was beginning to understand. The basement levels were the worst. Beneath the grandeur of the Vatican museums lies a network of storage rooms, maintenance corridors, and forgotten chambers. Some date back centuries, their original purposes lost to time. My duties required me to check the climate control systems, ensure the security of stored artifacts, and maintain the areas where restoration work took place. It was in sublevel 3, in a corridor lined with wooden crates containing God knows what, that I first heard the singing. A woman's voice, clear and beautiful, singing what sounded like a medieval hymn. The melody was haunting, unlike anything I'd heard in traditional services. I followed the sound through the maze of storage areas, my footsteps muffled by decades of dust. The singing led me to a section I'd rarely visited, a series of rooms sealed behind heavy iron doors. The voice seemed to come from behind one of these doors, room 77C. I checked my key ring, found the corresponding key, and unlocked the door. The room was small, cramped with wooden shelves, holding pottery shards, ancient scrolls in protective cases, and artifacts too old and fragile for public display. But in the center of the room stood something that shouldn't have been there, a child's rocking horse, carved from dark wood and painted in faded blues and golds. The singing stopped. As I watched, the rocking horse began to move, gently at first, then with increasing momentum, back and forth, as if an invisible child rode upon it. The painted eyes seemed to follow me as I backed toward the door. That's when I noticed the inscription carved into the horse's side. "For little Maria, beloved of God, 1591, 1595. 4 years old. Some cardinal's child, perhaps, or the daughter of a Vatican worker from centuries past, lost to plague or accident, remembered only by a toy, hidden away in the darkness." The horse stopped rocking. In the sudden silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of a child giggling. Soft, delighted laughter echoing from the empty air above the toy. I slammed the door shut and never opened room 77C again. But the incidents were escalating. Night after night brought new encounters, each more unsettling than the last. Footsteps following me through empty corridors. Shadows moving independent of their sources. The smell of incense in areas where none had been burned. Whispered conversations in long-dead languages. The Vatican's past was bleeding through into the present, and I was the only witness. The final incident, the one that broke me, happened in the Borgia apartments. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, had lived there in the late 15th century. The rooms are now part of the Vatican museums, filled with Renaissance art and historical displays. But late at night, they remember their original purpose. I was dusting the display cases when I heard them, voices raised in argument, speaking rapid Italian with accents I couldn't place. The sounds came from the Pope's former private chambers. I approached the doorway and peered inside. The room was transformed. Gone were the museum displays and velvet ropes. Instead, I saw the chamber as it might have been 500 years ago. Rich tapestries on the walls, a massive wooden desk covered in papers and maps, candles flickering in wall sconces. And seated behind the desk was a man in papal robes, his face flushed with anger as he shouted at someone I couldn't see. His Latin was too rapid, too archaic for me to follow, but his fury was unmistakable. He slammed his fist on the desk, and scrolls scattered to the floor. Then he looked directly at me. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and filled with a malevolence that seemed to reach across the centuries. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had ordered deaths, who had twisted faith to serve power, who had sold his soul so completely that not even death could claim it. He raised one ringed finger and pointed at me. When he spoke, his voice was clear as crystal. "You have seen too much, little mouse. But do not fear. You will join us soon enough. The Vatican keeps all its secrets and its secret keepers." The vision shattered like glass. I found myself alone in the modern museum room, surrounded by informational placards and tourist displays. But the smell of old parchment and candle wax lingered in the air, and when I looked down at my hands, they were trembling uncontrollably. I finished my shift somehow, going through the motions while my mind reeled. As dawn broke over St. Peter's Square, painting the ancient stones gold and pink, I made my decision. I left my keys with security, told them I was sick and going home. I never went back. That was 15 years ago. I've worked as a janitor in schools, office buildings, shopping centers, places built recently, with no history to haunt their halls. I sleep during the day now, when the sun keeps the shadows at bay. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear them, the whispered prayers, the child's laughter, the rustle of ancient pages turning. The Vatican doesn't let go of its people easily. Once you've walked those corridors at night, once you've seen what lingers in the darkness between prayer and dawn, you become part of its eternal congregation. They say Vatican City is the smallest country in the world. What they don't tell you is that it's also the most populated, if you count all the souls who never left. I'm telling you this story because I'm old now, and the voices are getting louder. Every night, they call to me a little more clearly. Pope Borgia's promise echoes in my dreams. You will join us soon enough. Maybe I will. Maybe there's no escaping the pull of those ancient stones, those sacred halls where so much history, both holy and unholy, has played out across the centuries. If you ever visit Vatican City, stay for the daylight tours, admire the art, marvel at the architecture, feel the weight of history in those magnificent spaces. But when the sun sets and the tourist groups disperse, when the great doors close and the lights dim, remember this: the Vatican never truly sleeps, and neither do those who serve it, even after their watch has ended. Giuseppe Mancini died in his sleep 3 days after giving this account to a local journalist. Vatican officials declined to comment on his claims, stating only that Mr. Mancini was a valued employee who served with distinction for many years.